Welcome to Muslims and Mental Health with Sister Heather, a groundbreaking program looking at mental health issues through the biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm.
Welcome to Muslims and Mental Health. Today I'm joined with Imam Marc Manley, and we're going to discuss the topic of legacy building in the African American Muslim community. Imam Marc Manley is a Detroit native who embraced Islam in 1992. He's worked in the Muslim community as a chaplain at both the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel University, where he started the first ever Muslim chaplaincy program. He currently serves as Imam and religious director of the Islamic Center of the Inland Empire in Rancho Cucamonga. Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off our discussion today. First, just to remind the audience, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, that the African American Muslim community makes up about 45% of the American Muslim population, which is the largest group of Muslims in the American Muslim population. So just a little reminder there of the community that we're talking about. And also that one of the reasons that we're doing this today is in honor of the African American History Month. So with that being said, I would like to start off by asking you, as we look at the legacy of African American Muslim community, what do you think makes this segment of the Muslim community unique?
I think probably one of the things that makes it most unique is that, by and large, the African American or the Black American community in America is the last community and the only community in the Western Hemisphere to experience essentially communal conversion, or the closest thing, to communal conversion. So, as Islam spread and you had communal conversion in parts of the Middle East that we now think of as Arab or Turkish, or as it spread to parts of Asia Minor or the subcontinent, where you had large numbers of, communities go into communal conversion, that never took root in the Western world, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic. So really we are that community that has come the closest to that. So I think that's something quite remarkable, but it doesn't tend to draw the same attention in terms of how people will talk about Islamic history. And it was through trade and all these things that in the archipelagos like Malaysia, Indonesia, how they embraced Islam from once not having been Muslim, and that's kind of celebrated. But yet in the Western Hemisphere, by and large, it's almost sort of like taken for granted that, Black people are Muslim.
Mm-hmm. And so you feel this sense of they're just a part of the tapestry of the community, where they have uncles and aunts who may not be Muslim, but everybody is still a part of the same community, essentially, as opposed to maybe, say, the immigrant Muslims, where there's a tendency to think that their family is somewhere else.
Absolutely. There's kind of a mystique. I think that might be on the ebb or on the wane, but there definitely is and certainly was a mystique of Islam in sort of Black mythology or Black history, in terms of, of course you have the Mansa Musas and all this history of Islam and African history, which kind of, get intertwined, in which once upon a time there were great, fantastic Black people or people of African heritage or descent that were kings and queens and rulers of the world or whatnot. So there's this prestige, particularly in African history, that you can sometimes tie a measure of prestige to Blackness through Islam. So that spilled over, particularly in the late or the early 20th century going forward. And I think that had a tremendous influence on a lot of the sort of heretical groups like the Nation, like, the Moore Science Temple, that looked back upon these as motivational to draw, esteem and honor. So, and yet we almost are kind of like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in the community, where we are this major percentage of the Muslim community, and yet we are hardly ever represented. When America wants to talk about Muslims, Black people tend to be absent, and even more so, I think when America wants to talk about Islam and they call upon the immigrant community has by and large been willing to indulge that and not include us as part of that tapestry. So, yeah.
Which leads me to my next question. I mean, you pretty much started discussing it already, but maybe you have something else you want to add to it, which is how do you think this segment of the Muslim community is different from other parts of the Muslim community in America, and how are they similar?
I think the Muslim community is different in the idea that actually, I'm an example. I embraced Islam in 1992. I didn't come through the nation. And in fact, I had some friends of mine that did. They came through the nation and then eventually they came into whatever you want to call Orthodox or Sunni Islam or however you want to phrase it. I didn't. I just had a friend that was Muslim, was kind of influenced by him. But nonetheless, I think many of us have felt a sort of indebtedness to groups like the nation, even though we may have disagreed, eventually with their theological bents. So it's kind of like part of our history, an unavoidable part of our history is heretical groups, which, not to say you don't have this also in the Muslim world where you have also heretical groups, but by and large, I think there's more of the, perhaps it is a mythology that they come for a pure strain of Islam, whereas not so in the Black American community, which in sometimes causes some very interesting psychological issues where perhaps we become great deniers of the indebtedness that we may actually owe to those groups, but because we feel that our authenticity as Muslims will be jeopardized by acknowledging that, even if we disagree, but just the acknowledgement of it alone may put us in jeopardy of being tainted in terms of our authenticity. So that's one way in which we're very different. I mean, we're the same in that I think we're both strangers in a foreign land. I think by and large, and this goes whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, I think Black people in America still labor under a cloud of being a stranger in a foreign land, even though we've been here for hundreds of years now. So I think in that way, sometimes there is a commonality between Blackness as the great other, and particularly post 9/11, how Arabness or Desiness or brownness is being pegged as another other to compete with that. So sometimes there's some commonality that's met there.
Mm-hmm. So with our shows, we like to include all the aspects of family and look at adults and youth as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering what you think are the key issues amongst the African American Muslim youth.
I would say the two biggest issues for youth are sex and agency.
Mm.
And again, a lot of times, I think, when the Muslim community begins to explore challenges in the community or challenges that we face, we tend to approach them as if this is unique to the Muslims, when in fact, this is just called modernity, or this is modern life in America or whatnot. So like all communities, Black, white, religious, non-religious, are struggling under the challenge of how do you, or can you even have a sexual ethics? And every generation has to come to define itself. So having the agency to be able to sort of, trailblaze your own path going forward. My concern is that we haven't done either one actually exceptionally well, and that's an area that we really, really need to work on. I think Muslims will be fooling themselves if they think that simply having a canon of laws that prescribe what sexual relations ought to be, that will be enough to actually deliver, a sexually ethical community.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise about the agency part. I think that, Sharia is often seen, Islamic law or the codification of Islamic law is seen as the end game scenario. So we just got to somehow find some way to, get a hold of a state apparatus, slap Sharia onto it, and all of our problems will be solved. Where the bulk of Sharia tends to be, prescriptive versus descriptive, right? So, if I'm a businessman, Sharia will tell me, okay, you can't have usury in your contract, but it won't actually tell me like what is a good business, but and that's where I think both the agency and creativity needs to come in, particularly for the younger generation, because history has shown that it's always young people that are going to be the innovators, the generators, to push it forward. So
that's a really interesting point. Who would you say or identify as being the key sort of players or stakeholders in that process of being able to deal with these issues of sex and agency?
I mean, I think a lot of it, it's going to be multifaceted. I think, on the family level, particularly for families that may have come here from abroad, from the Muslim world, and I know it's a very enormous task, but they are going to have to rearrange some of their mental furniture to accommodate where they're currently living at. And that doesn't mean having to sacrifice what Islam prescribes in terms of appropriate sexual ethics, but the way that it's clothed may look very different than back home. So I had actually a young couple come to me. They're both finishing. They just finished their freshmen, so they're actually sophomores now in college, and young man, young girl, both from an Arab background, and they're like, "Look, we can't take this anymore." The draw and attraction of being a young, vibrant, healthy, normal, not really teenager anymore, they're like in their 20, 21. They're like, we just can't deal with this. We want to get married. And actually, we want to be obedient. We want to be good Muslims. We don't want to step outside the bounds of Islam. And when I tried to talk to the parents to say, well, perhaps you should actually let them do this, but marriage will not be like it was when you guys got married, meaning that you had to have the PhD, the house, the $80,000 car, everything furnished. It may be that you actually support your kids, which you're already doing while they're in school, but you allow them to be married and work towards that versus continuing to kind of put them in a type of jeopardy. And there's been a lot of pushback and resistance from the parents because like, no, you have to have a degree, you have to be able to support, you have to do this and that. I'm like, well, that's not really the world that you live in, particularly in a society of which there is no longer any kind of, I guess you could say, social stigma for just acting out whatever, inhibitions that or not having any inhibitions whatsoever. And I was trying to explain to them, like, look, like your kids actually, like they want to do this. There's a lot of people that don't. They're trying to find the loopholes to just go do whatever they do. They actually want to do it by the rules, and yet the parents were kind of, so there's the family that will have to do some rearranging. Second, I do think imams are going to have to be, we need more honesty. It's not necessarily talking like Richard Pryor from the pulpit, and being vulgar. But I think we also do need to dismiss that simply talking about sex is in of itself not a vulgar thing. Right. And that, the Quran talks about sex. The Prophet, peace and blessings be on him, talked with his companions in a very frank and straightforward manner about the relationship and the manners between men and women. We also have to dismiss that every single contact or, batting of an eyelash or a glance between a man and a woman is necessarily like a promissory note to intercourse. And that we need to come up and, in some ways, return to a more honest and natural sexual ethics that maintains the boundaries of what Islam says, but allows people to breathe, So I think, the message needs to come from multiple areas.
It's a crucial part of our existence and something that we're going to explore more on this show in the coming months. But even in the animal world, preening and as you were talking about, the flirtation, it's actually quite normal. And it is a matter of just what are the boundaries and enforcing them. I think this is a great issue that you're exploring, and I will explore it more on this show actually in the coming months. At this time, though, however, I'd like to take a break. We'll be back to talk more with Imam Marc Manley after this short break.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. Again, I'm here today with Imam Marc Manley, and we're discussing the legacy of the African American Muslim community. We're now going to turn our attention to the elders in the community, and I wanted to ask Imam Marc, what do you think of the elders in the community? Let me start that over. What do you think the elders in the community need to contribute to leaving a thriving legacy?
I think that the leaders and the older people in the community in some ways have, I don't want to call it, obsessive compulsive disorder, because we're on a show talking about mental health and I don't necessarily want to poke fun at that, but I do believe they have some control issues, and that ironically the leaving of a legacy will not really be done by them, so to speak, as much as it will be, their legacy is their children. And the best way you can do it is just let them do their thing. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes there's a tendency for the older community to try to micromanage the next generation coming up, which often has disastrous results. And that ultimately you have to trust in God and trust in your kids. I'm a parent, and I'm already realizing, even though my child is under 5 years old, I'm already realizing that I will have a finite level of control over my child. I can have influence, no doubt, which will be greatly depend on my own level of sincerity and whatnot. But in the end, I do realize that it won't be me. And it also won't just be myself, my wife. It will be the people we associate and the other children that we allow. So I think it's kind of like, get out of the way. Not to quote a ludicrous rap song, but it's like, get out the way and let them, actually flex some of their muscles. Let them, spread their wings. Let them have the courage to utilize whatever talents that they have, however unorthodox that they actually may seem to us. Because one, we're not going to really be here. 20 years, maybe I'll be here. Maybe I'm in my 40s now. So 20, 30 years, I might not even be here. I can't, anything that I grasp on today is eventually going to slip away, eventually tomorrow. So I think it's to kind of get out the way a little bit and let them do their thing. And in fact, youth is kind of like a combination of genius and insanity, and the word genius itself is actually, related to a person that's, possessed by a spirit. So let them do their thing. That's what youth is about. And that all of us were youth, once upon a time. The great things that they may have done, like building institutions or mosques or whatever that they did, it's great. Let them do it now. So much of Islam has always been a young man's or a young woman's game, and let them do their thing. Kind of get out the way, and I always tell people, just keep writing checks until you check out. That's sometimes like the greatest thing you can keep doing is just keep writing the checks.
There was a book about that called Die Broke.
Yeah,
But I'm curious. We're so blessed to have you based here in California now, but you were in Philadelphia for a while. And I'm wondering, do you think there is a difference in regards to this, if the answer to this question, when you're looking at the two different types of communities? In Philadelphia you have a mainly indigenous population, whereas you have more of an immigrant population in California, well, in certain places. And
certainly, yeah, overall. Yeah.
What do you feel like the answer would be different, or is it the same?
I think it's still, it's like a different album cover, but the songs aren't the same. So yes, it's true here in Southern California, predominantly immigrant community. I mean, you do have some pockets of African American Muslims, but by and large, the immigrant community. Where in Philadelphia, the dominant expression of Islam is through the African American community. And yet, if you look at the tendency of the elders going back into that, kind of like control issue, it's very much the same, where the younger generation is domineered by the older generation. And what we're finding is that we live in a very porous society, and that it's not like you live in a homogenous society, maybe somewhere back in the Muslim world, and even then, but where maybe there would be social pressures put upon you to say, okay, you got to at least act like you're Muslim or act like you believe in this stuff. Here, people are like, I'm tired of this, man. I'll see you later. I got options. I can just go, I can just do some secular thing, for the next 50, 60 years. They can just sort of bounce out. So I think that, ironically, even though they are different, they sometimes have the same tactics, which may be actually a blessing, because if the tactics are same from coast to coast or from group to group, then the strategy to combat them essentially should work, hopefully, in both as well, to try to reverse engineer that.
Okay. Fair enough.
I don't want to try to say anything bad about my Philly community, but it was definitely an experience.
So what can be done now to make a positive contribution to this segment of the American Muslim population? I mean, how do you think people who are listening to us today and want to serve or make a difference or contribute positively, what can they do?
I think, a lot of Islam, a lot of religion, period, is about courage. And you're just going to have to really want it. I tell this a lot to the young Muslims, when we have our halaqah, or like a circle, in which we talk about stuff. And I'm like, I can give you all the factoids about Islam, about theology, law, spirituality. At the end of the day, if you have no ambition as a human being, as a person, to go and get it or to make it happen, then there really isn't much I can do. Now, I think as an imam, what I have to do is look at the structure of the community and analyze whether or not we are creating an atmosphere that is actually killing ambition. Are we deterring the youth from having the ambition to go out and do it? And even if it looks a little bit different than the way that dad and mom did it, or uncle so-and-so did it, or Imam Fulan did it, or whatever, to encourage them to have the courage. So I think one is maybe a rewriting and a restructuring of religious education, of devotional education, that actually is very experiential in nature and less cold, analytical, intellectual in nature, that will encourage people to actually implement the talents that they have, versus, okay, the only way you can be Muslim is to go out and to acquire this rare set of intellectual, talents and qualities in which you may not have, and spend the rest of your life searching the earth for these rare gems, and next thing you know, you die a person that never really fulfilled anything. Versus like, wow, I actually, I have all these talents myself. I don't need to necessarily be a scholar to be a great Muslim. I don't need to be a jurist in order to impact society. Maybe I'm a businessman. Maybe I'm an educator. Maybe I'm a cab driver. Maybe I'm a doctor. Whatever that it is, there has to be some way that you can impact society and change, and then ultimately feel a great sense of personal fulfillment in doing so as a Muslim.
We find this to be the case in psychology with motivational interviewing.
Right.
And the tendency for a lot of people to have what we call the writing reflex. And the writing reflex is where you direct people, you tell them it ought to be this way or how to be this way. But what we have found in the change process, to help people make change, if you do the writing reflex, they're likely not to make the change.
Right.
So, as you said, giving them more experiential experience of why is this? What's the motivation for you to do this? How does this align with your values? And how do they see making the change?
Right.
That often propels them to be able to make the change
Right.
because they see it as being from themselves and
Absolutely.
not being, somebody's putting this upon me. And
Yeah.
I think if with our youth especially, if we try to implement more of this type of change process, we'll have a lot more success. But having said that, I really so appreciate your insight because I had spoken on another episode about how we need to have more of a collaborative process between the imams and the community leaders and the mental health professionals, because we can't leave out the spirituality. We operate from a spiritual paradigm, and we can't leave the spirituality out.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, we have come a long way in the biological sense, from the biological perspective, as well as the social paradigms and the psychological paradigms that allow us interventions where we could work collaboratively and be more successful.
It would be foolish to throw any of those out. And in particular, I think our community is one in which the goals of Islam and the goals of being a Muslim are written in gold, like in the sky. I mean, it's like, you say, okay, so when you pray, you should have, in Arabic, what we call khushu', you should have focus in your prayer. We hear that over and over and over and over. But what we don't get is a methodology of how to achieve it. And this is one of the major issues, is that we have goals without any methodology on how to achieve them. So people either live their entire lives frustrated as Muslims or stunted in their growth, or ultimately they just go, this can't be it. I'm going to go do something else. So I think, I think one of the ways of achieving that is, like you said, is to tap into the advances in, both the biological sciences, the behavioral sciences, the studies of the mind, and then having the courage as leaders to just, like almost like a smorgasbord, tap into that which is compatible theologically, of which the bulk of it will be, and give people actual methodologies of how to achieve greatness as Muslims that isn't solely reliant upon being in the mosque 24 hours a day, or only going to a special madrasa, or going to a magic land of which you sat around and kicked rocks or whatever there was, right? I mean... Having
said that, though, I do think literacy is part of the problem in the community. A lack of literacy and Islamic understanding, seerah, sunnah. I think if people had more, that they would understand a methodology within that context. But having said that, at the same time, the collaboration of all these things, I think, will be a good move forward. So this kind of brings us to the end of those questions. And is there anything else you would like the audience to know about this topic of the legacy in the African American Muslim community?
I would say the only thing I would add, which is just touching on the part we just finished, is that, and I think this is applicable particularly to the Black American community, but really to the Muslim community as a whole, is that people in leadership position, whether that is activist or scholar, need to have professional pedagogical skills. So the only way to realize what we just talked about is if you, as the person in that leadership capacity, is actually a qualified educator, versus just simply, I've been a student of knowledge, or I sat with a sheikh, or I did okay, that's great, but we're in a different paradigm than that now, and that while there is obviously a place for didactic, speech, in the Muslim community, it has to move beyond just simply repeating what's in the books and in the text, and we need qualified educators. So imams themselves should be willing to hold themselves to a higher account, and sometimes you have to be honest. You know what? Maybe I should step down from this because this isn't what the community. Maybe the community doesn't need me. The community needs him or her, and I should support him or her to actually stay versus clutching on to positions of power. And I see that a lot
or
in the Black community.
Referring out. So like, if you have a couple come to you and you don't have training in couples counseling, maybe referring them to somebody who does.
Absolutely.
You know, whether it be a therapist or another imam who does, but
Right.
you know, somebody who has the qualifications.
And that's primarily what I do in my role as imam is I do referral. I do the intake because people, you know, Muslims often feel a little bit uncomfortable about the whole prospect of itself because it's still very much taboo and there's the shame factor because a lot of Muslims come from shame cultures and whatnot. So they come in and my role is to make them feel comfortable first about what they're doing and it's a good thing that they want to seek help. And then I make them understand that, you know, your issue isn't going to be resolved by reading the last chapter of the Quran or, you know, making some litany or whatnot. Like, you need to go to a mental health professional who is not me,
Right.
right? But I give them also the emotional support to understand that it's okay to do this. And I found that to actually have great efficacy, that it's like, all right, well, the imam is saying that this is what I should do. So I'm going to put faith in that. So I do, you know, we can be motivators.
So imams can be great stigma reducers.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Or, you know, if you're not careful, you can create the wrong kinds of
That's right.
stigmas, right?
That's right. Well, thank you. As part of our tradition of interview episodes, we like to ask a few fun questions at the end.
Okay.
And I'm going to start with, who is your Muslim hero, if you have one, and why?
So I know this will probably seem extremely biased and programmed, but the closest, really my Muslim hero would be Dr. Sherman Jackson. There's great figures in Muslim history that I certainly admire for their intellectual achievements or spiritual levels that they reached and whatnot. But for me to have a hero, it's somebody I need to have shook his hand, you know, or need to have looked her in the face. Or so it has to be somebody that I've met. And probably, I mean, and anybody that will see this will know that, you know, easily the most influential person in my life in the last 25 years has been Dr. Sherman Jackson. And it's because for me, he is the most prophetic human being that I've ever met. Like, for me, he actually embodies a earnest human attempt to try to follow what the prophet actually said and did and laid out in a way that's accessible to me, that makes it seem that I actually can have a shot at it, you know. So yeah, he would actually be my Muslim hero.
Okay. And what is your favorite concept in Islam and why?
My favorite concept in Islam is probably, you know, what Imam al-Shatibi called the maslaha, or, you know, that idea of working towards communal good, that Islam's, you know, broad civilizational goals are to maximize benefit and to minimize detriment. And I find that that's a great maximum that you can live by as a human being, as a group, you know, as a society. So that's probably one of my favorite concepts in Islam.
Okay. And what would you say is your favorite word and why?
My favorite word is probably the word taqwa, because it is such I think a word that's been mistranslated into English, and it's very elusive, but in its use, particularly in Revelation, that God uses the word taqwa in a number of ways, both as an infinitive, as a concept, but actually more often as an imperative. So it's a concept that can only be realized by actually doing it, which its root is to actually protect oneself, you know, meaning from divine chastisement. So I love it in the fact that it's kind of like Bushido. You know, it's like the Muslim version of like Way of the Samurai. You know, it's like it is this philosophical concept, but at the same time you draw your sword. You know, so it's
So for people that are not familiar with the term taqwa, could you do a more direct translation?
Yeah, the literal translation of taqwa means to protect. It isn't, you know, it's often translated as fear God or these things, but there's actually other words in Arabic that are much more appropriate to the word fear. But taqwa is really about protecting oneself from the displeasure of God, particularly in the ultimate sense in the hereafter. And therefore, you know, Allah or God talks in the Quran about have taqwa of the fire, or have taqwa of a day. So it's not just a concept, but it's used in the imperative mood, meaning that it's actually something that you do. So having grown up very influenced by Japanese culture and philosophy as a kid, studied the language, and for me, like Takawa is sort of like the Islamic version of Bushido.
Samurai.
Yes.
Okay, well, great. I want to thank you so much for coming today and speaking with us. This has been a great beginning to this conversation that I hope that we can continue. Maybe we can even see Imam Marc back sometime to discuss more issues around the African American community or just the Muslim community in general. So we are very much interested in your feedback, your concerns, and any ideas you have that you would like to see addressed in the show. You can contact us by email at nafshealertherapy@gmail.com. That's NAFSHEALER therapy@gmail.com. This concludes this episode of our show today. Thank you very much, and tune in next time.